Hey you, do you like drawing stuff? But do you hate drawing scenery? Or at least do you find the concept of drawing up a proportionally accurate 3D space from scratch and remembering all the details therein while also maintaining accurate dimensions no matter the angle you need to draw said background from confusing at the best of times and impossible to fathom at the worst? Then boy howdy is this the video for you! Hello, hope you're doing well. And I mean that even more so than normal because it has been a minute since I was last able to hop behind my microphone like this and check in with you guys. So I just hope you've been taking care of yourselves and that you've been having a nice day, and if not, I hope it gets better from here on out. Now, if that goofy little intro wasn't evident enough, I have a very specific topic in mind for today's video. It's kind of a rabbit hole that I fell down recently, which has just completely changed the game for me when it comes to drawing scenery. Which is usually something that I have a bit of a hard time wrapping my head around, to be honest, because my brain tends to not quite be able to see the forest or the trees when it comes to imagining what kind of scale I should be drawing any given backgrounds in. Which, to make a long story short, is what led me to, in a 3-hour burst of hyperfixation, downloading Blender, so that I could try my hand at drawing scenery in 3D instead of struggling to sketch it the traditional 2D way. And somehow I managed to figure out a system that really works for what I need to do. And although a disclaimer is very much needed here to restate that I am not by any means an expert at Blender, in fact quite frankly I don't entirely know what I'm doing in the program whatsoever because again I only really learned how to do what I'm about to show you in a 3-hour ADHD fueled experimentation session, but if nothing else I still at least really wanted to share my limited knowledge on the subject and kind of talk you guys through this method of drawing in 3D space that I've cobbled together because it's really fun and I know it's going to be really helpful to me in the future for comics and anything else that might require the same background to be drawn from various angles, so hopefully it might be helpful to some of you guys as well. Before we get into the thick of it though, this is probably a pretty good moment to mention that this video is sponsored by Skillshare, which if you're not already familiar is one of the most prevalent places on the internet to visit if you're looking to learn about a whole host of topics from people who actually are experts in that particular field. From storyboard lessons by Sarah Beth Morgan and character illustration classes by Gabriel Piccolo, to courses on animation and photography and beyond, as well as several new courses to help you stay centered while working towards a better work-life balance. There's pretty much going to be a class on Skillshare to quench any kind of knowledge that you might be thirsting for. If you want to try out Skillshare for yourself, then you can head on down and follow the link in the description of this video, and as an extra little bonus, the first 1,000 people who do join by using that link will get a full 1-month-long trial of Skillshare completely for free. And like I say, I learned the stuff that I'm going to be covering in this video over the span of about a day, so just imagine how much you could learn in a whole month. Anyway, thank you very much again to Skillshare for sponsoring this one, and yeah, without further ado, let's get into this very slapdash but hopefully very thorough tutorial. Alrighty, so first things first, before we even start up the 3D software, I thought it would be a good idea to cover some of the more abstract stuff, so that we don't get all turned around when we do jump into Blender. In particular, I want to really quickly go over the bare bones basics, at least as best as I can articulate them, of how to think in 3D. So, what is 3D? Let's start there. The answer is that I don't entirely know, because I'm neither a scientist, nor a mathematician, nor anyone who really knows what they're doing when it comes to sculpting 3D models. But what I do know is that the D in this instance stands for dimensions, and there are several kinds, which you probably already know of. For instance, 2D is very generally speaking the term that we would use for anything flat, like a square or a piece of paper. 3D is the term for anything with depth and volume, like a cube. 4D is a cinema screen that sprays you with water, and 5Ds is when you play card games on motorcycles. There are definitely more accurate descriptions available for the various Ds there, but for our purposes we're only really going to need to understand those very basic ideas of 2D and 3D. Reason being, when we draw on paper or on a digital canvas, we are drawing in 2D, and the process I use for drawing in Blender is actually the same. I'm still always drawing on a flat 2D surface, it's just that Blender allows me to choose where that surface is and which direction it's facing, which allows me to build up lines in 3D space until I can make a sketch that is really more like a wireframe sculpture that I can rotate and look at from any angle. I realize that might sound a bit confusing at this point though, so I'm going to go ahead and cover a couple of Blender specific terms to try and help explain what I mean. So the 3D space within Blender is made up of a grid with an X, Y, and Z axis. Those are the three directions that make up its own three-dimensional space. But that does all sound very mathematical, probably because it is, which is why I personally find it a lot easier to think about it all in terms of something a bit more tangible, like two-dimensional sheets of paper instead. So picture with me, if you will, several sheets of paper. And all of this is going to be very relevant later on, so this is definitely a part to pay attention to. But when working in Blender, your x-axis is also called the side view, your y-axis is also called the front view, and your z-axis is also called the top. Not because it's smoking hot, but just because it's for the top-down view of whatever it is that you're drawing. So this is mostly going to be used for floors and surfaces and things generally like that. And the way this all looks in 3D space is that these X, Y, and Z's are all going to be doing their thing on the grid and going in the directions that they go in, but the point where they overlap and intersect is going to be the focal point, the central anchor that your drawing surfaces, or imaginary pieces of paper, are going to align themselves to. And then, as you draw on each of those pieces of paper, you should be able to build your sketch up into an actual 3D structure like this. And if you want to add more depth and layers of detail, then you can just copy and paste elements around like this, or move that focal point to wherever you might need a new sheet of paper to be, to allow you to keep drawing and building your scenery completely freehand. If there are any elements that you want to add that are at a bit of a tricky angle, like a slanted roof or diagonal line for example, sometimes it can also be a bit easier to draw that particular piece a little ways away from your main sketch, and then just use the transform tool to rotate and move it into place. Anyway, a lot of this advice is going to make a lot more sense once we actually get in and get familiar with the program, so let's go ahead and open up Blender so I can talk you guys through how I go about setting up a canvas. Alrighty, so when you do open up Blender, this is pretty much the layout that you're going to be working with, and the first thing that you're going to want to do is pick the kind of scene you want to make. Obviously there are a bunch of different kinds for 3D stuff, like sculpting in general, but what I tend to use is this 2D animation one. And the way that's going to look when you do open it up is kind of similar to a lot of drawing programs. There's going to be a lot here that does look pretty familiar, and also a lot of stuff that looks wildly unfamiliar. So first things first, I'm just going to go through the way that I tend to go about setting up a canvas. So the first thing that I tend to do when opening a new canvas is go up here to this little symbol. And it's going to look like some options are grayed out, but you can actually still click on them. So what I do is click Grid and then go through and tick these little boxes on the side that say X, Y, and Z. And what that's going to do is make a kind of vertical line appear in the middle of the white space that we're currently working with here. I won't get into the exact reasoning for that because it's really more tied to some of the 3D features that we're going to be getting into in a second. So instead, for now, the next thing that I do when setting up a canvas is I come here to this kind of layers palette and I turn the camera layer invisible, purely out of personal preference because I prefer to sketch without seeing it. Now this next bit is very important. What you're going to want to do is head up to the top here, and where it says Origin, you're going to want to switch that to 3D Cursor. And the reason for that is because in conjunction with this other drop-down menu on the side, you're going to be able to switch between the options for front, side, and top, just like we talked about before with the imaginary pieces of paper. And whichever one you have selected at any given moment is going to be the direction that your pen is aligned to. This is kind of the basis for being able to sketch in 3D in the way that I do, but it's also something that I always forget to switch between properly when I am trying to change directions in my sketch. So yeah, basically if ever you're trying to draw something and the lines are not going where you expect them to, just make sure you have that second drop-down menu set to the right direction for what you're trying to draw. Anyway, that covers all of the basics that I try to set up as soon as I open a new Blender project, but there's still a fair few bits of like tools and features, all of that kind of stuff that I think it would be pretty helpful to get familiar with before diving in and beginning a sketch. So let's begin with another kind of basic thing, which is what are we going to be drawing with? Well, if you direct your attention to the right hand side here, you'll see that it already loads in with the pencil tool selected. And with that you can basically draw in the way that you would expect any normal pencil tool to draw. Do a little squiggle, whatever you need to do. But if you want to draw with a different kind of texture, if you click on it, there are actually a couple of other different pens that you can use as well. So you've got a pen tool, a couple of markers, some airbrushes. If you use the pen tool, it comes out a whole bunch thicker and more solid. And if you switch to the chisel marker, it's going to come out a whole lot thicker, but also a whole lot thinner in places because this one seems to be a lot more sensitive to pen pressure. When I'm sketching though, I tend to use the pencil tool, so I'm going to switch back to this one. But let's say you need the pencil tool to be a bit bigger. You just want to go up to the top here where it says radius, and you can either slide that up and down with your mouse, or you can type it in manually. So I'm going to change that to 50, and as you can see that makes the pencil tool come out a little bit thicker. Likewise, if you want it to come out a bit stronger, You can change that strength factor and that's going to make it come out darker, kind of like the pen tool. But what if we end up needing to erase any of the lines that we make? Learning is a process after all, so we're definitely going to make some mistakes. Well, what you're going to need to do is head on over to the left-hand side here, and as you can see, it's got a tools palette, kind of like we'd get in any other drawing program. And we just need to select the one that looks like an eraser. Much like with the pen tool and the marker and the chisel, there are a bunch of different kinds of eraser that you can use, but the default one that it loads in with is called Eraser Soft, and this one works kind of like an airbrush. As you can see here, there's all the different kinds, so we've got this airbrushy one, and then there's a harder eraser and some other kind of harder erasers. But like I said, this one works kind of like an airbrush, so you just erase the area you want and it's going to come out with that kind of soft-edged texture. But if you're not looking for something quite so painterly, what I tend to use is this one, the Eraser Point, and that just gives you a much more solid erasing kind of texture. But what if there are entire lines that are in the complete wrong place? Well, one of the erasers that you can use is this one on the furthest most right side, and what that's going to do is as soon as you click on a line, boom, the entire thing is gone. And that goes for anything that's overlapping in the wrong place. You just click on it and it's going to get poofed completely out of existence. So that's the basic fundamentals of pencils and erasers all covered, but what if we want to draw in colour? As you can see, the default colour for the pencil tool is black. But if you want to change that, all you need to do is head on over to the right hand side under the tool itself to where it says Color Attribute. If you're still in material mode you won't be able to change this, but in Color Attribute any colour that you pick on the wheel will be the colour that you draw in. Whether it's purple, or yellow, or anything you want really, just whatever you pick on this side is going to be the colour that you draw in. When you switch it back to material mode it will default back to being in black and white. But let's say that you have a line that's in the perfect place, it's just in the wrong colour. Well, what you want to do is head over back to the left-hand side, and just under the eraser there's this tool called Tint, and what that tool lets you do is recolor lines that have already been drawn. No need to switch to color material mode because this tool only has the one setting, but just like with changing the color of your pen the normal way, whatever color is selected on the wheel will be the color that you can then paint any given line to. And to the best of my knowledge, this should affect anything that is within your line of sight when you're working in 3D. The same should go for the eraser as well, so both of those tools are just something that you're going to need to be mindful of when you're switching from a 2D to a 3D mindset. With that in mind though, I think it's about time to cover how to get into 3D. So far during this whole explanation, I have been explaining all of these things as if in 2D space, like a normal drawing program. But the truth is that we've actually been in 3D space already this entire time. We've just been looking at it from one angle. So if you want to change your point of view, what you want to do is head up to these symbols that have been loitering in the top corner. And it's the one at the very top which is gonna perhaps need the most explanation. As you can see, it's got these red, green and blue lines going up, down and side to side, and the trick with this one is that once you hover over it and you can see that it's highlighted, you can click and drag, and that is going to allow you to rotate your canvas in 3D space in any direction that you like. As you can see, this 3D grid also features a red, green and blue line, and the only reason that we can see those is because we hit the X, Y and Z buttons that I pointed out at the beginning. These basically just act as guidelines to remind you of which direction is which. So that's how we rotate in 3D space, but what about these other tools in the top corner? Well, this bottom one with a grid on it, I don't entirely understand. The next one up with the camera symbol is basically a button that you can press to return to that default viewing position that we started in. It's connected to the camera layer that I made invisible at the beginning of this, but like I say, the only reason that I did make it invisible is because I don't like seeing the camera as a physical object when I'm rotating around and trying to draw. The next tool is one that I use a lot more frequently, which is a hand pan. This is much more similar to normal drawing programs. Much like with the little rotating tool at the top, you just click and drag on this hand and it's going to let you move around horizontally and vertically. And then again, this tool is a lot more familiar. With the magnifying glass, you can just click and drag and that's going to let you zoom in and out really quite far from whatever it is that you're drawing. Now I know I said as much earlier, but the red, green and blue lines on this grid roughly equate to the red, green and blue arrow example that I showed you guys at the beginning, which means that by default when you load up a new canvas like this, your pen will align itself to the intersection of these three lines, which in turn means that when we start drawing, our front, top and sides are all going to align themselves a little something like this. Which brings me on to another very crucial point, which is that if you want to change the focal point that your surfaces all align to, what you're going to need to do is pick your new location by rotating your grid until you can see it clearly, and then hit Shift and right click. And although that won't move the position of these red, green, and blue guidelines that you can see here, it will change the location that your surfaces are aligned to, and that is going to be the new center point from which your pen is now going to function. Anyway, now that we know what 3D space looks like in Blender, I just want to bring us back to these wiggly lines for a second. Reason being, I want to show you guys how to use the transform tool. So if you have a line that you want to transform, what you're going to want to do is head up to this top left corner where it says draw mode and change it to edit mode. And that is going to bring up a new set of tools for you to use. The default it's going to be set to is this rectangular marquee that's going to let you select things. And then for the most part, the default transformation tool that I use is this one, which lets you transform it any which way you like in terms of position, scale, and rotation. And if you use Clip Studio, this should hopefully look pretty familiar if you've ever used any of the 3D model features in there. Now, the reason that I wanted to come back to these wiggly lines in order to show you guys how this tool works is because while from this angle it might just look like I'm rotating it flat on, like just from frontways, I suppose. If I switch back to drawing mode and then go ahead and change our viewing angle with the little compass here, you should be able to see that any rotation that I've made to this object actually does affect it completely in 3D space. So if I switch back to edit mode and twist it around a bit more, then you should be able to see that the red curve spins it around the red guideline, the blue curve spins it around our blue guideline, and the green curve spins it around the green guideline, almost as if those guidelines are acting like skewers. But yeah, all that's to say that evidently the X, Y, and Z axis are very, very important, and a lot of what you try and do when drawing in 3D space like this is going to come back to those three directions. That's also pretty much everything I know about tools and canvas setup and all of that kind of thing, so I think it's about time to actually show you guys what it looks like to put all of that stuff into practice. Okay, so this bit is probably going to feel a whole lot more familiar to my usual kinds of videos because I basically just hopped into Blender and tried to record some actual footage of what my 3D sketching process looks like. There are a couple of things that I do want to point out here though before getting too far into it. Namely that for the sake of demonstration, every time I change the direction of my drawing surface while working on this one, I also change the color of my drawing tool to match that direction. So green for any lines that I drew in front view, then red for side view, and blue for anything drawn in top view. Like I say, this is mostly for the sake of this particular demonstration, so that you guys can hopefully have a clearer look at how all of those different directions come together to form one whole piece, and hopefully have a better idea of which lines I'm putting where. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure to mention that right off the bat so that it was clear that the color of my pen changing whenever I change directions isn't any kind of automatic feature that you need to look out for in this program or worry about, because all the colors that you're going to see me sketching with here are just ones that I picked out manually. The second thing is that I've also edited some extra bits and pieces into this footage here and there to try and make those directional switches really, really clear. So anytime I use that shift and right click function that I mentioned to relocate my focal point during this drawing, you should hopefully see a little computer mouse pop onto the screen at the point where I'm setting it to. I also tried to add either a red, green, or blue directional arrow to make it a bit clearer which direction my imaginary piece of paper would now be laying in. Even just over the course of drawing this quick sketch though, I still forgot to change my surface direction before trying to sketch at a new angle multiple times. So likewise, you should also see a circle pop up around the drop-down menu at the top whenever I do eventually remember to switch it to the direction that I actually want to be drawing in. So anyway, with all of that in mind, as you should hopefully be able to see here, I decided to keep this piece pretty simple by turning the example drawing that I've been using to talk about how all of this 3D stuff works up until now into an actual 3D drawing. So basically what I'm looking to do here is put together a kind of 3/4, I think it might be called isometric drawing, I'm not actually too sure. But in any case, what I'm trying to make here is a pretty basic little house with 2 of the walls missing so that we can see inside. Now, as I'm going through and working on this, hopefully it should be pretty clear how that shift and right click function is helping to change the coordinates that my pen is basing my lines around. But I also want to note, now that it's actually visible on screen here, how when you switch between the red and green or front and side settings, it acts in both cases as if the imaginary piece of paper you've placed is standing up vertically, which is why they're good for drawing walls like this. But when you switch to top mode, or the Z-axis, it's more like you've laid a piece of paper out flat, which is what makes that the best setting for doing floor and surface detail. I feel like that's probably pretty evident by now, but it's one of those things that I just really want to make sure to emphasize, because it took me a hot minute to wrap my head around that difference when I started trying to figure things out in Blender for myself. If you do ever get muddled though, you really can just refer back to thinking of all this as if it were a pop-up book or some kind of papercraft like that. At least in my case, again, I know that makes it feel so much less confusing to think about. You should also be able to see here that after finishing the basic floor plan in blue, I did also switch back to the red direction to draw the roof out separately from the other lines on the x-axis, before using the transform tool that I mentioned before to resize and rotate it into place. One thing I don't know if I mentioned before though is that when using the transform tool, the little cube shapes will let you change the scale of something, and the little cone-shaped arrowheads will let you move whatever you're transforming along that particular axis. Getting the roof on was the last piece I needed to finish roughing out the basic structure, and truth be told, I tend to leave my 3D backgrounds a bit more on the sketchy side like this, but I really wanted to show you guys as many features as possible with this one, which means it's time to move on to inking. However, making a new layer to do the inking on was perhaps one of the most confusing things for me to try and figure out here, so I do want to take a minute to really quickly explain how I eventually managed to figure it out. So after quite a bit of trial and error, and again this could be a very roundabout way of doing things, but it worked for me, so here you go. But yeah, if we take a look over at the layers palette, it looks like the layer called Lines is the one that my current sketch is on. So I clicked on it and then went down to the blue slider near the bottom right here and used it to whack the opacity down. After that, I went back to the layers palette and made sure that I had the collection folder selected again, before going over to the top left of my workspace and changing it from draw mode to object mode. From there, I clicked add and then went down to grease pencil and picked blank. And as you can see here, that made a new layer appear in the layers palette, which I promptly renamed by double-clicking on it so that I could tell the difference between my ink layer and my sketch layer. And then, yeah, from there I was able to click on that newly made layer and not worry about it being tethered to match the opacity of my original sketch layer, which was a problem that I had been having up until that point for some reason. But yeah, long story short, that's how I made a new layer with its own opacity settings to make sure that it's actually fit for inking with. Anyway, getting back to the actual drawing itself. After laying out the rough sketch, I wanted to go back over everything to add some more detail, so I picked out one of the pens that seemed to have a nice texture, and zoomed way back in to start adding some clean lines. The same goes for when I was working on the sketch too, but a lot of the time I find it's way easier to draw accurately when working in 3D if you rotate your viewing angle so that you're actually looking at whatever it is you're drawing from head on like this. I still tilt my viewing angle around here and there to check how everything's coming together from different angles, or take a look at whether a certain line looks right when viewed from the side, but for the most part when putting in details like this you're gonna see that when working on the X or Y axis, I make sure that I'm looking at it flat on, while taking a more bird's eye view when drawing anything on the Z axis. I know I already said that, this was going to be a very slapdash tutorial because I kind of picked up how to do all of this in the span of a 3-hour hyperfocus binge, so I am by no means any kind of authority on the subject, but truth be told I actually learned even more while trying to record the process of making this. I hadn't really messed around with ink pens or layers until deciding that I wanted to try and figure them out for this video, and I don't know, I don't even really know if I have a point I'm heading for with this because it's really more of an anecdote than anything, but it felt really nostalgic because ever since I was a kid, I kind of learned how to use all of the programs that I'm fluent in today by just getting hands-on and messing around like this to try and puzzle things out. Photoshop, Clip Studio, even my recording and editing software that I use for all of my videos nowadays. Like, I didn't learn about them in school, I just really enjoyed the process of figuring them out. So yeah, if you take anything from that, please let it be the very sappy energy of how genuinely fun it is to learn new things. Anyway, part of the bundle of new things that I learned while working on this one is that I think going forward I might stick with this method of like tidying up my 3D sketches rather than just leaving them sketchy. I feel like that might sound like a very common sense realization to have at this point, but the reason I mention it is because my main inspiration and reason for downloading Blender and learning how to do any of this in the first place was because I wanted to try and build my own, like, pre-made set pieces and, like, ready-made scenery models like this that I could use for comics in particular. Originally, I tried to figure out the actual 3D sculpting tools that Blender has available, but safe to say all of those cones were way beyond my realm of understanding. So I'm really glad I was able to figure out this method instead, because although it was very, very daunting at first, once you get the hang of it, it does genuinely become really intuitive, and because I'm obviously more of a 2D art person myself, it just feels way more organic and authentic to the way that I'm used to working. All that to say, I think for the purposes that I'd be using it for, which is like yeah, just that idea of having a fully rotatable, pre-made sketch of a background, especially for locations that you know you're going to have to draw multiple times over if you're working on a comic or anything like that, and being able to look around it and get it to the angle that you need before pasting it into your drawing software, and then like, boom, you can just ink over it there while saving yourself a ton of time, energy, and brain cells. Yeah, I think if you're going to be using it for that kind of thing, it makes more sense to, you know, put a little more effort into it at this stage and actually go in and put the fine details in while sketching it out in Blender, rather than just leaving it as a basic layout sketch where you have the placement of things but not the detail. Because then you can also make sure that, again in the case of a comic for example, you can make sure that your continuity doesn't get messed up between scenes, because if you've already got any important details of the environment drawn into your 3D sketch, then you won't need to worry about forgetting them or accidentally leaving out a detail when it counts. As you can see here, going back over to ink everything also not only allows you to clean up the rough lines that you already had in place, but also to add more details that you might not have even laid out before, as your pen starts moving and your mental gears start turning, like with the picture frame and the curtains that I put in here. When it came to cleaning everything up on the floor though, I needed to start mapping things out a little bit more in my mind's eye, because the guidelines I'd sketched out for the furniture were really just the basic outlines of where I wanted them to be placed. Their actual depth and detail and form, however, was going to come from using the right-click and shift function to change my focal point many times over in order to layer up a bunch more line work in a bunch of different directions and build them up into proper shapes piece by piece, kind of in the same way as I did for the house at large. So the way I began putting the furniture together here was by first cleaning up those basic guidelines, and then after inking over the doormat and the rug, the main shapes I knew I was actually going to need to build up from those outlines were a couch, a coffee table, and a little side table. So what I did next was use shift and right click to change my focal point and lay out another batch of outlines that were pretty much the same as the ones I'd just drawn for those objects, in order to figure out the height that I wanted everything to be at. I could have done this bit with copy and paste, but I didn't know if I wanted to add more detail to certain things at this point, so I just freehanded it, even if that meant trying and failing to draw a clean circle for the side tabletop several times over. After double checking my lines by rotating my viewing angle, I did decide to add more detail to this level of the couch by mapping out the shape of the cushions and the armrests. After that came the coffee table, which was much simpler, and then I had a good look around to check how high everything was. It felt like the couch and coffee table were a bit too tall, so I had to angle myself around until I could get a clear line of sight to only the parts that I wanted to move, and then use the rectangle marquee to select them, before using the transform tool to raise and lower them along the Z-axis until they felt like they were at a proper height. The rest of the furniture building process basically consisted of working on the X and Y axis to connect the dots by drawing lines that would link the top levels of the furniture to their outlines on the floor, as well as adding some extra outlines in the red direction to act as the back of the couch. Because this is being drawn with the intention of it just being a rotatable sketch meant to be drawn over in another program and kind of finished there, rather than aiming to be a really clean, accurate 3D model in and of itself, I also wasn't really fussed about any lines overlapping, because as long as I understood what I've drawn here and what each shape is meant to be, it would still be fit for purpose. Which is why when I started working on the coffee table, as you'll see in a moment, I only used the eraser to get rid of the outline on the floor, rather than any parts of the legs that overlapped with each other or with the couch when viewed from different angles. Speaking of the purposes of this kind of sketch though, it might be worth mentioning that I'm also really excited to figure out what other ways I could put this drawing technique to use. I don't know if any of you have ever played Townscaper, for example, but it's a really cute little town building game, but the cool thing about it is that it lets you export the towns that you build as 3D models, which you can then import into Blender. And when you have a 3D model that you want to work with in Blender, you can actually still use this same 3D sketching method to add extra detail to it by drawing around it in 3D space. So I definitely think that's a function that I'm going to be playing around with a lot more too, because I think that kind of thing, like importing or putting together a basic 3D model, even if it's just a bunch of rectangles, and then sketching over it, would be a really helpful way to go about making a 3D reference for not just backgrounds, but also for props and weapons and anything like that. And again, throughout the entirety of this video and my own personal learning process here, I'm basically treating Blender as a way to make rotatable sketches that I can then screenshot and paste into my drawing software as a base for certain aspects of my artwork in order to streamline my process. Basically doing the hard work in a tool that makes the hard work a little bit easier so that I can help myself figure out how to properly, consistently draw things that I would otherwise find it way harder to do, while still being able to draw them in a way that's unique to me, because I'm still drawing them, just with newfangled methods. But yeah, I think this footage is just about coming to a close, so before I get on to showing you guys some close-ups of how this all turned out, I want to bid you guys good luck if you do want to go ahead and try this out for yourself. And although I don't doubt that there are absolutely things that I have gotten completely wrong here or that could be done much more efficiently, I don't know, I kind of got possessed by the spirit of learning and figuring out things and having fun along the way with this one, and I just really wanted to talk about it, so I hope it's been a good time and that you can take away a bit of that same energy from this, and hopefully just feel ready to dive headfirst into trying out whatever it might be that you want to have a go at. Because if the amount of trial and error it took me to put this video together is anything to go by, you should never let the fact that you don't understand something yet stop you from trying to understand it in the first place. And actually, on that note, well, it's kind of a side note, but I have also made a playlist recently of all my videos that I would consider to be more on the educational side, like this one, and I fully plan to keep it updated anytime I put out a new tutorial type video in the future as well. Kinda like a one-stop shop for all my really knowledge-heavy content, if you can call it that, because again, I don't really know what I've been talking about here, but it is what it is. So yeah, that's going to be in the end card if you do want to check that out and bookmark it for future reference, or, you know, whatever you want to do. But yeah, without further ado, because I have talked quite enough for one day, let's go ahead and take a proper look at how all of this turned out. Anyway, that's just about it for this video. Hopefully it's contained at least a few bits of helpful advice to help you guys go forth and experiment. And if you have any tips, tricks, or advice of your own that you would also like to share, please feel free to do so down in the comments, because I am absolutely open to corrections on this one. For now though, I hope you'll all keep on staying as safe, happy, and healthy as you possibly can, and I'll see you next time.